It's time to hide your denims and your dungarees, put those Wranglers in a case and lock them up tight, get your Levi's in the closet, make sure they're hidden, secret, and safe, because today we're talking about Genestealers. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about Tyranid Genestealers, a fan-favorite unit of Tyranid players the world over, and one of the most powerful units in the faction in 8th edition, and talking about their viability in 9th edition, which has been questionable at best, I think. Recently on the YouTube community page over on the channel, I dropped a little poll. I wanted to talk about some specific tactics with Tyranid units. The overall winner, which in fairness I was mostly expecting, was Carnifexes, but I want to do sort of a more in-depth video on Carnifexes a little bit later on, so I'm putting a little bit more thought into that one. That said, I've gotten a ton of questions about Genestealers in the last couple of weeks, and I still wanted to talk about Genestealers, so we're going to do a datasheet deep dive on them today. We're going to be covering, just as we do in every datasheet deep dive video, a review of the datasheet itself. We're going to talk about the unit attributes, what this unit is good at on the tabletop, some combos you can use along with them, both from the core Tyranid Codex and for each Hive fleet specifically, as well as custom Hive fleet adaptations you can use alongside them before we render a final verdict on the unit, and we answer the question: should we put Genestealers into our Tyranid army? As always, if you enjoy this style of content, you like these datasheet deep dives, and you want more Tyranid stuff, let me know down in the comments. Also, drop a like on the video and a subscribe on the channel if you haven't already. It really helps let me know what kind of content people like, and then I can make more of that. And then, you know, you can watch them and enjoy that content too. So it's like a win-win, you know? Why not do it? Definitely let me know as well if you really like the Tyranid content, because I love Tyranids, and I'm happy to talk about more Tyranid content. So drop those comments and those likes on that video, and I'll be doing more Tyranid videos in the not-too-distant future. But anyway, let's talk about Genestealers today, and go over their datasheet and all the cool abilities on it. Genestealers are a troops option for a Tyranid army. They come in units of between 5 and 20 for a very hefty 15 points a model, which is, I think, where a lot of people get a little gun-shy about this unit. They are expensive troops models. For those 15 points, however, you get a high movement value of 8, which is supplemented even further in their datasheet, which we'll talk about in a sec. Good weapon skill of 3+, their ballistic skill basically doesn't matter. They can take a ranged weapon, but you probably won't. They have an average strength and toughness value of 4, only 1 wound, but 3 base attacks, and that also is a little bit deceiving because their datasheet also has additional attacks on it with some requirements. They also come in at a superb leadership of 9, although oftentimes you won't need to use it, given that it is a Tyranid unit, and that they do benefit from synapse, so most of the time they're going to be immune to morale anyway. Unfortunately, their save characteristic is not very good at only a 5+. Like I mentioned, they come in a unit of 5, but you probably won't be taking 5. They can go up to 20, which is a lot of times where you're going to be taking Genestealers. Usually it's either no Genestealers or a full unit of them, and the reason for that we'll talk about momentarily. Interestingly, every single model in the unit can take Scything Talons, and that is a free upgrade. So there is literally never a reason not to take Scything Talons. They don't replace any of their existing weapons. They don't cost any additional points. They just give you another weapon option to pick from when you go to fight with the unit. And one of the hallmarks of Genestealers is that they have a lot of different weapon profiles to swing with, which makes them relatively flexible fighting against a variety of unit types. They have a couple paid upgrades as well. They can take Flesh Hooks for 3 points, which is the range weapon you can take with them, and it's an assault weapon, and it's kind of a super pistol. It comes out at strength 4, no AP for 1 damage, but it is 2 shots, and you can shoot it at enemies who are in melee, or if you are in melee, which is pretty cool. Interesting situations with Flesh Hooks you can be in are trying to dig units out from enemy engagement. You can try to shoot them during the shooting phase, and if you kill the enemy unit, then the unit they're engaging can then activate in the shooting phase. You can also be engaged with somebody and shoot at a different unit. Flesh Hooks are actually very flexible. The downside is only that 6-inch range, and they are very expensive. Genestealers are not really a shooting unit, so you're not really going to be wanting to take Flesh Hooks unless you want to add a little extra points in there, but sometimes you kill a guardsman with those things. As another free upgrade, you can also take Acid Maws. Just like the Scything Talons, this does not replace a weapon, nor does it cost any points. So a Genestealer unit looks like it's not really taking many upgrades. However, when you go to add the unit to your army, always add Scything Talons, always add the maximum number of Acid Maws. There is no reason not to. It's another melee profile you can choose to attack with when you go to swing, and they come in at a base AP of 3. Now, normally, the entire unit is armed with Rending Claws, which are a base AP 1, but if you roll a 6, they go to AP 4. The Acid Maw is a little bit more consistent AP value, so normally if you're attacking an armored target, you're going to want to swing with the Acid Maw. That said, the Acid Maw models also have Rending Claws, so if you're swinging against something that's toughness 8, you can make all your attacks with Rending Claws, because then if you roll 6s to wound, which is the only way you're going to wound anyway, it's already going to be AP 4, so it's just an extra point of AP. Or if you're attacking something with no armor save or just an invulnerable save, you can swing with your Scything Talons, and then the entire unit rerolls ones. It's a very flexible unit when it comes to its melee profiles, and that makes it very good in a wide variety of situations. You can also take a couple additional upgrades. Toxin Sacs, which deal an additional damage on wound rolls of a 6. These are exorbitantly expensive for Genestealers. I think the reason for that is that they do have Rending Claws on their profile, so when you roll a 6 to wound, not only are you going to be AP 4, but you're also going to be 2 damage. Unfortunately, this upgrade, while it seems really cool, is just too expensive. Basically, write off any paid upgrades for Genestealers, only take the ones that are free. You can also take Extended Carapace for 2 points. It gives you a 4+ save characteristic, which isn't terrible, and in Tyranids, a lot of times you're going to be a little bit burned on good saving throws. You can even combo this with a couple other adaptive physiologies that we'll talk about a little bit later on to make them a little bit survivable. Unfortunately, you lose their Swift and Deadly ability, which we'll talk about in a sec, which is a really big loss, and it costs extra points. I think generally, I would leave this upgrade at home. There are some combos you can use with it that make it the unit like a little tanky, but unfortunately, I don't think any of them are particularly good, and not for 17 points a model. So it's a cool upgrade to have access to, but unfortunately, you just lose too much for adding it, so I would mostly write that off. Now, talking about the abilities, the Genestealers' abilities, like their weapon profiles, are a very important part of the datasheet. First off, we talked about their attacks value being relatively deceptive. That's because of their Flurry of Claws ability, which gives them an additional attack as long as they have 10 or more models in the unit. This is why you typically want units of 20 Genestealers, because it makes it that much more difficult to push them down to that 9 model count where they go down to only 3 attacks. That said, 3 attacks a model is still pretty good, and 4 attacks a model, excellent. The full unit's swinging 80 times, which is incredible. They also have a 5+ invulnerable save, which is amazing. That means that 5+ save characteristic isn't that big of a deal. It does get them to a 4+ save if they are in cover, which is sometimes pretty nice. But you always have that 5+ invulnerable to fall back on, and this makes Genestealers just sort of a little annoying to kill. Sometimes they spike really high on their invulnerable saves, and there's nothing your opponent can do about it. They just don't die. Their Swift and Deadly ability is one I just mentioned is being very important. They can advance and charge innately. You don't need to cast Onslaught on them. They're just going to advance and charge all the time. So combined with that high base movement of 8, that means that on an average advance roll, the floor of this unit is that they're just about as fast as like a Jump Pack Vanguard veteran. And that is a really good floor to be at, especially considering that this is Tyranids, and this is arguably the fastest faction in the game. There's so many ways to buff the threat range of this unit. They go light years. And one of the reasons that this unit scares a lot of people is in 8th edition, the Genestealer rocket was real. You could send these guys, infinite distance. They could almost always catch something on the table and almost always wrap it, lock it in combat, and eventually slowly kill your opponent from there. Genestealers have given the bad touch to a lot of armies over the years, and a lot of people are still really scared of them, and for good reason. Lastly, they have their rule Infestation, which is a little bit interesting of a reserve rule. It allows you to put Genestealers in reserve in your army, and if you do so, you get 4 little tokens. They're actually little markers that are included in the Genestealer kit, and you get to put them in your deployment zone. Then you can set up the Genestealers in reserve, and they can come in wholly within 6 inches of those infestation nodes, regardless of their proximity to enemy models. That said, the infestation nodes do go away if enemies move within 9 inches, so realistically, you're never going to get that much extra distance out of it, and given that it's a reserve ability, most of the time if you're playing matched play, you cannot bring the Genestealers in until turn 2, and they cannot move after they get brought in. So you can't, for example, keep them in reserve, bring them in turn 2, and then Hive Commander them to get them into threat range. If your opponent just doesn't go near the infestation nodes, or uses their chaff units to clear the infestation nodes, it could be really bad for you. This is an interesting ability, but unfortunately with 9th edition 40k games only lasting 5 rounds, and you're basically taking the first 3 rounds off for one of your most expensive and important melee units, it's probably not worth it. I don't think there's almost ever a situation in which you want to use Infestation, and if there is a situation in which you would want to set them up in reserve, you can use this strategic reserve rules to put them in with a little bit more flexibility because they can come in off any table edge, and there's no way your opponent can kill all the Infestation nodes accidentally. So it's a kind of a flavorful, interesting ability, but it's really not really worth very much. The unit doesn't have many keywords. They are infantry, however, which is a really big deal, especially for a unit as fast as they are, because they can go through breachable terrain. And they ostensibly have the Genestealer keyword. Lets you do Genestealer stuff with them. So on the whole, what does this unit typically do? Obviously, you want to take large units of them. Small units are, I think, while probably pretty effective, they are a little bit fragile, because if they lose even one model before they go in, you've immediately just lost 13 attacks out of that unit, which is pretty brutal. So usually you're going to want to take the big units of 20, and that means that they are monumentally expensive for a unit that, despite having that 5+ save and an average toughness value, is relatively squishy. 300 points for a unit of 20 is a lot of points, and really means that you have to have a role for Genestealers in your army if you want to include them, and you have to baby them a little bit. You can't just sort of throw them out willy-nilly like you would with a Gant or a Warrior, another cheaper unit. You have to keep them safe and then use them only when the time is right for them to strike on their opponent. Fortunately, that's a pretty flavorful way to play Genestealers. They're going to lurk in the ruins in the back of your deployment zone. They're going to hide in amongst your other Tyranid units before they jump out and leap on an unsuspecting opponent. Makes a lot of sense for the Genestealer design style. That said, once they get stuck in, they are brutal for a lot of matchups. 80 attacks out of a full unit of them, potentially rerolling ones to hit. They have access to bonuses to hit, potential bonuses and rerolls to wound. Depending on the Hive fleet you're bringing them in, it does a massive amount of damage. They can knock out Toughness 7 vehicles in one swing if they need to. They also mince through light infantry. Any lightly armored infantry unit gets absolutely dumpstered by Genestealers. They're good against Necron warriors. They're good against a lot of Harlequin units. They're good against most of the light infantry that's on the table. The downside is that they struggle a little bit against Toughness 8 for one, which is sort of a common weakness of Tyranids in general. Toughness 8 is a little bit of a difficult break point for them to get through, and they struggle against heavier infantry. So something with a decent armor save, with a high toughness value, or a bunch of wounds that hits pretty hard in melee can fight Genestealers pretty hard. The Genestealers will always get the drop on them because they will typically massively out-threat whatever unit they're going into, but they can't necessarily punch through a lot of defensive abilities. So if you're trying to send them into Blade Guard veterans or Death Shroud Terminators or something like that has high armor saves, a high invulnerable save, typically a lot of wounds, damage ignore rolls. A lot of times the Genestealers won't kill them, and they can hit the Genestealers back very hard, kill a lot of Genestealers in the swing back. And that's a little bit difficult for Genestealers to deal with. So there's some matchups where Genestealers are not super duper useful. That said, being an objective secured unit, and one of the strengths of Tyranids in general is that their troops options tend to be very good, which means they have a wide variety of very long threat range objectives secured, is that Genestealers, even if they dive on an enemy unit and don't kill it, they will be taking an objective away from them almost 100% of the time. That means that you can use Genestealers as a one-shot kill on an objective, for example. If you need to break your opponent's banners, stop their actions, get in and just disrupt their victory point scoring for a round, even in their worst matchup, Genestealers will just do that for you. They'll go in, they'll sink into a unit, they'll maybe not kill it, but they'll wrap it, they'll trap it in melee, they'll force a desperate breakout, maybe you can wrap multiple units using some chicanery that we'll talk about later, and they can deny that objective for at least one round, potentially multiple rounds, if, like I said before, those invulnerable saves spike up. So while they're expensive and pretty focused in what they do, Genestealers are almost always a useful archetype of unit to have that very fast objective secured. This means that Genestealers almost have two capacities that they operate during the game. Early game, a lot of times they're hiding in the back. They're making sure you don't awkwardly lose that early investment too quickly, because if your opponent is able to get a beat on them with a big unit with a lot of high volume of attacks, you can just lose that 300-point unit in one go, and that's no good. You don't want that to happen, so you're going to keep them relatively safe, and in that role, they're playing as a counterpunch to stop your opponent from engaging their guns. So even in a Tyranid list that's not necessarily aggressive, Genestealers can still be a good pick because they can make it very difficult for your opponent to trade up into your ranged attackers. Then, later on in the game, if your opponent has lighter units that are exposed or units that are Genestealers are good at killing, or you just need them to go and disrupt victory point scoring for a round, you get up there, drop all of the threat range increases on them, get the double move going with Swarmlord, and they will rocket up the table, probably burn a unit down, wrap another unit, and they probably trade at that point. They a lot of times will just get killed, but you can stop your opponent from scoring on that round for the most part. And while the unit itself is very finessey, there's not a lot of flexibility to them. They just punch in melee and they're super fast. So if you need a unit that punches in melee and is super fast, there you go. Now let's talk about some combos that we can use alongside Genestealers. Now there's a couple ones that are pretty straightforward. For example, the Broodlord has a 6-inch aura that gives Genestealers +1 to hit. Solid. Very good. You get to get that weapon skill down to a 2+ if you're attacking light infantry with an invulnerable save. You can hit on a 2, rerolling 1 with the Scything Talon, and that means that they convert almost 100% of your attacks. So you're going in with 80 attacks, you're probably going to hit 75 of them or so, which is enough to kill most units in the game. Swarmlord, also an absolute auto-include a lot for almost every Tyranid list, and especially has special synergy with Genestealers, because he allows them to double move. And you can, because of his ability, advance when you double move, which means that this unit could be going probably somewhere around 24 inches before it charges. And that's without any additional threat range increases on that unit. There's also a couple ways to protect them in the early game before they get stuck in, when they're hiding in the back line and waiting to get moved up the table. Venomthropes or the Malanthrope can keep them safe with -1 to be hit. While Malanthropes are much safer, I'm a big proponent of Venomthropes given that they're way less expensive. They do more damage themselves, and especially for units like Genestealers that are not monsters, they actually have a much larger aura that they affect, since their 6-inch aura comes off each model in the unit, not just a single model. So they can spread out a little bit. The Genestealers not being a monster as well means that even if 2 of the Venomthropes out of a unit of 3 dies, this last remaining Venomthrope will still affect them, and that gives them an additional layer of being difficult to deal with. On top of that, a Maleceptor works pretty well to protect them with Encephalic Diffusion, the Stratagem. Because the Genestealers have an even toughness value, it actually affects them a little bit more than it would another toughness value. So usually if you are playing with a Maleceptor, you're going to want your army to be focused on toughness 4 and toughness 8. The reason for that is that it affects the widest variety of ranged attacks that's hitting them. So Genestealers, for example, -1 strength on enemy attacks means that you are essentially giving -1 to be wounded from strength 3, strength 4, strength 5, and strength 8, because strength 3 obviously goes to strength 2, which means you're wounding them on 6s. Strength 4 goes to strength 3, which means you're wounding on 5s, and strength 5 goes to strength 4, which means you're wounding on 4s. So even -1 to wound across the board. And those 3 strength values are the majority of especially anti-infantry weapons in the game. Strength 8 obviously goes also to strength 7, which means they're wounding on 3s instead of 2s, which is pretty nice to have as well. So with a toughness value of 4, they do have pretty good synergy with Encephalic Diffusion. Lastly, there's a couple ways to deep strike them outside of using strategic reserves or their infestation ability. You can use the Lictor with Pheromone Trail to bring them in. You can also use a Trigon to bring them in, or the Jormungandr Stratagem. Now let's talk about some stratagems you can use alongside them, and oh boy, there are a lot. Now, I don't think I'm going to hit every single synergy that Genestealers have in the entirety of the Tyranid Codex, because being a melee-focused infantry unit, that's where a lot of Tyranid buffs are focused, and so they can benefit from almost everything. I'm not going to talk about everything, but I'm going to hit the highlights of the ones I think are very important. The first one, which is a little bit of an awkward synergy, is Metabolic Overdrive. It allows a unit to move twice in the movement phase at the cost of potentially taking mortal wounds and not being able to shoot or charge later on in that turn. That said, what Metabolic Overdrive is really good at is moving your support characters into range to buff Genestealers. So generally speaking, Genestealers are so fast that they will outrun the characters that are trying to affect them. This means that a Broodlord, for example, with the same movement characteristic as a Genestealer, trying to catch a Genestealer unit that is advancing twice before it charges is very difficult with only that 6-inch aura. However, if you double move that Broodlord, usually it's going to be in range that you can trail a Genestealer back to get that +1 to hit off of that guy. The same goes for Swarmlord. If Swarmlord is placed relatively defensively, and the Genestealers can very quickly outstrip him, and so if you don't want to chain back, you can Metabolic Overdrive Swarmlord into range to get that double move going in the shooting phase to get them into range to charge. There are a couple ways to buff Genestealers' threat range. Both Hunter's Drive and Hive Instinct are good at getting units into melee by rolling an additional dice on a charge and dropping 1, although they are a little bit difficult to set up. And once you're there, there's a couple ways to do additional damage. Aggressive Adaptation allows you to roll on as soon as you've killed an enemy unit. A lot of times, if your opponent has forward deploy units that Genestealers can get to grips with, you can finish them off, use Overrun, which we'll talk about in a sec, to play a hit and run game, and use Aggressive Adaptation to make your subsequent attacks more powerful. That doesn't always happen, though. It's a little bit difficult, so I wouldn't really count on that, but it is a cool synergy. You can also use Implant Attack to finish off units that you haven't quite killed. If you just have one model left in the unit, you can deal a mortal wound to them. And thanks to a recent FAQ, for some reason, the rules as written don't actually support this at all, but GW has elected to rule it such that Implant Attack counts as the unit destroying the model. So you are able to do things like use Feeder Tendrils to eat characters, or then trigger Overrun if you've killed something with an Implant Attack. It's a little silly, but it does work that way according to GW. We just mentioned the Feeder Tendrils. That is a Genestealer and Lictor only stratagem that allows them to regenerate CP if you have killed characters. This means that in some matchups, Tyranids actually have an enormous number of CP, especially things like Imperial Guard or Adeptus Sororitas, where Genestealers are playing very aggressively and trying to get hits on characters because they are very good at killing, especially Toughness 3 characters. They just eat those things for breakfast, and when they eat them, you get D3 -1 CP back thanks to Feeder Tendrils, so that's pretty useful. You can also use Adrenaline Surge to double fight with them once you get stuck in, which is very common if you're trying to get the most out of your Genestealers before they get killed, and use Savage Distraction, since usually when they've committed, they're going to be very aggressive and right up in your opponent's face. Once they destroy a unit, they can broadcast an enormous bubble of -1 to hit across the entire army. I mentioned Overrun before, and I think it's a very important one for Genestealers. It allows a unit to move in advance at the end of their fight instead of consolidating. So this means that you can move up, attack a unit, kill it, and then move even further forward to get additional distance on your opponent or to contest or control their objectives. This is crazy if you can trigger it on your opponent's turn. If you kill your opponent's units, a lot of times you can run onto their objectives with an objective secured unit yourself, then take their objectives for the start of your turn so that you score additional VPs. That's a really good way to force through 15 victory point swings, which is a big, huge deal. You can also just use it to play a hit and run game. You can go out with the unit, attack a slightly armored enemy unit, kill them, and then overrun back behind an obscuring piece of terrain to safety. That's also good as well. Overrun is one of the best stratagems in the game, and it is certainly one of the best stratagems for a unit like Genestealers that's very fast and very aggressively melee focused, and I would absolutely consider that one of the top ones to keep in mind when you're playing Genestealers. Additionally, you can do some interesting things with the combination of Overrun and Adrenaline Surge. One thing that you can do if you're trying to stop your opponent from shooting at you is charging a unit at the front of their army, killing them using Overrun to then move and advance at the end of that fight. Then, at the end of the fight phase, use Adrenaline Surge. It allows the unit to be elected to fight, but you don't necessarily have to have an eligible target to make your attacks against. So, they will pile in and then they will consolidate at the end of the fight phase for an additional 6 inches of movement, which could potentially wrap a bunch of enemy units or engage all of their guns. This also allows you to push your Savage Distraction aura farther forward. There's a lot of interesting combos with these guys that you can use to really disrupt enemy gun lines. Moving on from the stratagems, let's talk about some psychic powers. Given that Genestealers are an aggressive melee unit, almost all of the psychic powers in the Tyranid Codex work pretty well alongside them. One of the reasons that they have such a high base leadership value is that they are often out of synapse range when they're moving farther forward. Usually what you'll find is that unless they're supported by a Broodlord or something like that, they act as sort of an independent operator as soon as they commit to the fight. So they're so far forward and away from your army since they move so quickly that your auras will be, back towards the back line of your gun line, and a lot of times Genestealers won't be in that aura. Dominion can change that. You can basically put them inside a synapse aura until your next psychic phase, which is pretty good. Catalyst also keeps them a little bit alive and effectively gives them a 4+ invulnerable save against damage 1 weapons between the 5+ invulnerable save they have base and then 1/3 of the failed saves then converting into damage ignored from Catalyst, and that makes the unit very annoying to kill. The Horror you can cast on enemy units that you expect to be swinging back on the Genestealers, which makes them, again, a little bit more difficult to kill. Paroxysm can potentially make it so that your opponent has difficulty swinging back at the Genestealers since you can deny them any of their abilities to interrupt. Talking about the core Warlord traits, the only one that I can really see as being particularly worth mentioning is Mind Eater, which is super cool if you want to wombo combo a big hit and run turn, but honestly it's very inconsistent. It requires the Warlord to kill an enemy character in melee and then also be in range to target the Genestealer unit with Mind Eater, so it's highly inconsistent and eats one of your adaptive physiology slots. Generally, you're not going to be taking Warlord traits as a Tyranid player, so I would not really consider most of these. And lastly, let's talk about adaptive physiologies. While most of the adaptive physiologies that you're going to see on the table are for increasing the survivability of your units, and Genestealers don't really do that, there are a couple interesting combinations you can use. Adrenaline webs is good to ensure that you can wrap multiple enemy units after your fight phase. Unnatural reactions is really good if you're playing a defensively oriented army because it allows your Genestealer unit to play farther back, and if your opponent tries to engage into you, they have to deal with that potential heroic intervention, otherwise the unit can just pile into them and kill them. A lot of times you can play a Genestealer unit relatively far back and just threaten your opponent with the ability to engage your guns, and then once you do it, the Genestealers come in and just wipe those guys out. So that's a pretty good combo as well. Lastly, Dynamic Camouflage is pretty good in a specific combo in Jormungandr. High Fleet Jormungandr, which we'll talk about in a moment, gives your entire army cover, which means that the Dynamic Camouflage triggers on the Genestealers, and alongside extended carapace to give them additional +1 to their armor save. You can get them to a 2+ armor save. Unfortunately, not only does it cost additional points, it also removes their swift and deadly ability and requires that they don't advance in order to get the benefit of Jormungandr. So overall, it's not a very good combo. It's just an interesting one to talk about. That said, there are some really good custom Hive fleet combinations that you can use alongside Genestealers and that I like to use myself. First off, Pack Hunters, pretty good. Gives you an additional AP when you attack a unit with fewer models. That's most of the units in the game, and honestly, most of the larger units in the game that you're going to be fighting against, like big units of demons or orc boys or something like that, you don't need +1 AP against, so it's fine. But if you're hitting Space Marines or vehicles or something like that, +1 AP on the entirety of the unit is very good. Hyper-Metabolic Acceleration is a really good one because it allows you to reroll your advance rolls, and this unit will be advancing basically every single turn of the game. So getting that reroll whenever you roll a 1 or something and you end up CP rerolling it anyway is pretty good consistency. Biometallic Cysts is an interesting one as well. It makes your Scything Talons base AP 1. Now, I like this one personally because there are a lot of situations where having 1 point of AP but also the rerolls is much better than swinging with a Scything Talon. For example, if you're going up against a 6+ save, having to swing with the Scything Talons to get through their save is kind of annoying. You're losing a little bit of efficiency there. So having the Biometallic Cysts available to you to punch through that 6+ save is pretty good. The math works out, I believe, that if you attack a 5+ save unit, it is better to have your Scything Talons to reroll 1s than it is to swing your Rending Claws for the additional point of AP on 6s. If you swing against a 4+ save, swinging the Rending Claws versus the Scything Talons with Biometallic Cysts are actually mathematically identical. However, that changes if you are +1 to hit because the reroll becomes better. So if you have a Broodlord in your list, Biometallic Cysts is a pretty good way to go because you can swing into a 4+ save, you can reroll your 1s to hit and be AP 1 all at the same time. And that means that most of your attacks convert and you have sort of the best average AP value possible. It's not a big flashy combo, but it does make the unit a little bit more mathematically consistent, and that's what I really like about it. The last one that I'm going to mention is my very favorite, Feeding Frenzy. Based on when the custom Hive Fleet adaptations came out, I'm not super surprised that this one sort of flew under the radar, given that in 8th edition, the engagement rules were a lot easier to pull off, whereas in 9th edition, having to be within half an inch of somebody within half an inch of an enemy is a little bit more difficult to get your whole unit of 20 in. That said, Feeding Frenzy is probably the best Hive Fleet adaptation on the list here. It allows you to make pile-in moves up to 6 inches instead of up to 3. I can't believe I ever played without Feeding Frenzy in the past. This is so incredible for large units like Genestealers, and I mean even for other units. It allows your unit to almost 100% of the time get every model in the unit into melee. It's not even that hard for the most part. It also almost works as a threat range increase, since even a very low or average charge roll will mean that the unit gets this enormous spike in movement because they get to move 9 inches between their pile and consolidate. So even if you've rolled exactly so that the farthest forward model of the unit can get exactly in melee with the single farthest forward model in the opponent's unit, with that extra 6 inches of movement, the entire unit can then spring in to engage that enemy unit and everybody gets to attack. The unit being objective secured also means that being able to pile in additional inches to get more of them into objectives is huge as well. You can break banners at the end of the charge phase, you can contest objectives, you can just move ridiculous distances across the table. Feeding Frenzy, #1 custom Hive Fleet adaptation if you're playing any melee infantry at all. It basically gives your whole army like an honorary doctorate in being a Hormigant, which is a pretty good place to be. Now, last but not least, before we move on to our final verdict, let's talk about some specific Hive Fleet combinations. There's a couple sort of mediocre ones. Jormungandr, I mentioned before, gets you the combination to be 2+ armor save. Hive Fleet Hydra is okay, gives you rerolls to hit sometimes, but they're already 2+ weapon skill. They already have access to the rerolls from Scything Talons if they need them, so that's not amazing. You can also use Endless Swarm on Genestealers and Hive Fleet Hydra, but like, why? Are you going to play 300 points down so you can pay for an additional unit of Genestealers? Like, no. You're just going to buy a second unit of Genestealers if you want it. No love for Hive Fleet Hydra, unfortunately. Hive Fleet Kronos, there's nothing special there, but the fact that the unit's so aggressive means that they deliver Deepest Shadow okay. And they also support Kronos Gunline pretty effectively, just being that counterpunch unit, like I mentioned before. So I don't hate them in Hive Fleet Kronos, but usually if you are bringing Kronos, you're going to be wanting to bring a second detachment of a better Hive Fleet anyway to play your more frontline stuff. Hive Fleet Leviathan, additionally, makes them a little bit harder to kill with that 6+ damage ignore, although a lot of times they're going to be out of range of Synapse creatures to get that, unless you're playing with a Broodlord that's far forward. That said, you can a lot of times keep them in Synapse with Hive Nexus, which is pretty good, and the Stratagem War on all fronts, as long as you have a flying unit in melee, so like Sky Slashers or random Gargoyles or a Flyrant or one Neurothrope can give them reroll 1s to hit and wound, which is pretty solid, given that it buffs their Rending Claws pretty significantly. Now, some of the more interesting ones, Hive Fleet Gorgon buffs your entire army in the fight phase, giving them reroll 1s to wound, which is very solid. In addition, Poisonous Influence is another way to get that +1 AP value, and it's awesome off a Broodlord, since a Broodlord already wants to be up close to the fight and get those units in its aura already. Having an additional aura of +1 AP on those models is great also. Just keep in mind that Poisonous Influence affects only models in the unit, not the unit itself. So you need the Broodlord to be within that 9-inch range of every single Genestealer in order to get the maximum use out of the psychic power. Kraken is the classic home for Genestealers. Everything that Kraken does is super good on Genestealers. Genestealers are already an incredibly fast infantry unit. Tyranids have multiple ways to make them even faster and more deadly, and Kraken just buffs that up to the extreme. You roll 3d6 and pick the highest for your advancing, which you're going to be doing every time because they advance and charge for free. You can use opportunistic advance to double that distance as well. So a lot of times you're going to be rolling a 5 or a 6 almost 100% of the time on that Kraken advance, and then doubling that to an additional 10 or 12 inches of movement. Ridiculous speed. On top of that, they also have Synaptic Lure to reroll your charges, so your charges are even more consistent after you go that ridiculously long distance. And even their Warlord trait to fight first in the fight phase is pretty okay, especially if your opponent has any fight last abilities. That said, the tables and generally the missions in 9th edition are smaller than they were in 8th, so I found that a lot of times the Kraken benefits are a little bit lost on Genestealers, given that you don't need to move that far to get to enemy objectives. A lot of times all the objectives are in like a 24-inch bubble, and it turns out that's well within the threat range of a double-moving Genestealer unit. So a lot of times Kraken, you're giving up a lot in order for that ludicrous speed. It's some of the fastest threat ranges in the entire game, so if you really need that speed, it's pretty good. But most of the time I found that you can mostly leave Kraken at home for some of the more interesting combinations. I think one of the most interesting ones being Hive Fleet Behemoth. Obviously, their adaptation is pretty good for any melee unit. Giving them reroll charges makes your charges a little bit more consistent, but the real combo, the real pièce de résistance in Behemoth is their psychic power for +1 to wound. Given that almost every Tyranid 6+ ability works on modified hit or wound rolls rather than unmodified rolls, means that +1 to wound actually buffs your Rending Claws to getting their Rending ability on 5s rather than 6s. If you also have them with Toxin Sac, that works as well. You're probably not going to be using Toxin Sacs, to be honest, so that's not that great. But it does mean that you get that AP4 quite a bit more, and having a high volume of low or mediocre power attacks with +1 to wound is exactly where you want an ability like that. Unfortunately, it does sort of rely a lot of your game plan on a very inconsistent psychic power that's kind of difficult to cast. You can make that a little bit easier with Resonance Barb and with Neurothrope. That said, it's a little too inconsistent for my taste, but the power is really there. This is the hardest hitting Genestealer unit out of the Codex, and they really wreck stuff when you get that +1 to wound off. So with that in mind, let's talk about the final verdict. Should you put Genestealers in your army? Now, I mentioned at the top, Genestealers have been a little bit of a controversial unit throughout all of 9th edition. Right at the change of 9th edition with the Minotaur and Field Manual, they bumped up a full 20% in point cost. And while they were relatively expensive infantry in 8th edition, they weren't that much above the curve in terms of expense. And a lot of times Tyranid lists would be based on 2 or 3 units of Genestealers and then build the rest of the list around them. Putting them up to 15 points a model and creating a metagame that's not very conducive to what Genestealers want to do, which is hit medium or light infantry really hard, meant that Genestealers were a very difficult ask for most Tyranid lists, and we almost saw them go entirely extinct in 9th edition. That said, the absolute raw power of factions like Adeptus Sororitas and Harlequins have really put the ball back in Genestealers' court. Genestealers are incredible against a lot of the top factions in the metagame. And while they're not very good against Space Marines or similar armies like that, what they are excellent at doing is A, fighting hordes, which is something that Tyranids are not very good at with their current codex, and B, killing those light infantry, especially out of transports that Hive Guard have popped them out of. That means that Genestealers follow up with the classic Tyranid gunline archetype super duper well. You can have Exocrines and Hive Guard destroy enemy transports even out of line of sight, then have the double moving Genestealers get up, clear all of the enemy units that were in those transports out, and then overrun back potentially out of threat range. This means that in the current metagame, Genestealers are super good. And while they're not very good in every single matchup, like I mentioned during the unit attributes, the floor of the unit is that they can go in and disrupt enemy scoring and hold objectives for a turn or two. And at the very core, that's probably just fine, given how much control Tyranids typically have over your opponent's VP scoring. Given that a Genestealer unit, even if it doesn't match up well against the profiles that your opponent has, they can get up, they can clear a unit off of an objective, they can disrupt their scoring for a turn, then you can follow that up with metabolic overdriving OBSEC units like Termagants or Ripper Swarms or Warriors. That can a lot of times put your opponent on such a VP deficit that they eventually lose the game when it comes to the end. So even at the base level, Genestealers are still a pretty fine unit archetype, if a little bit too expensive for them. That said, Genestealers are an incredible finesse unit. They are not a unit that you can just double move in and charge into your opponent's army and hope to do well. You need to be able to pick your fights really well, and you need to be able to navigate the fight phase as well as possible. And if you can't do that, they might be a little bit too expensive for you. So, generally speaking, I'd say yes, Genestealers are great. One unit of Genestealers is great. I don't know if I would ever take two. They're a little bit too expensive for that. But having one unit as that silver bullet to deal with situations that the rest of your kind of static Tyranid gunline or slower Tyranid melee units can't really deal with is incredible. They are super useful in competitive play. That said, in order to run them efficiently, I would definitely practice your fight phase stuff, practice your wrapping, practice your consolidate and pile in moves. Make sure that you know all of the fight phase rules down pat before you play Genestealers, but once you do, you're going to find that Genestealers are a pretty decent unit to have on your side of the table. So anyway, that's it. That's the talk about Genestealers in 9th edition for Tyranids. I love that this unit is playable again. I think in the metagame of nothing but Space Marines for days, Genestealers probably not that good, but against Harlequins, against Sisters of Battle, against Necrons, they are super powerful, and they can a lot of times sort of end the game just by themselves prematurely alongside the power of some of the Tyranid ranged attacks. They also play very defensively when they need to. They're a very flexible unit. They're just too expensive, I think. They're just a little bit too expensive for what they do. Maybe bumping their defensive capabilities, maybe making them a little bit cheaper, probably puts Genestealers right where they need to be. But I'm pretty happy with how the unit performs right now, to be perfectly honest. I've had a great time playing them. I've had a little bit of success playing them competitively as well so far in 9th edition. I played a lot of games with them. And I'm excited to play more. So bring on the Genestealers. I want to thank everybody for watching the video. Hopefully it was interesting and helpful to you. If it was, go ahead and drop a like, drop that subscription, do all that stuff. Also, big thanks to my patrons over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. Those are sweet people. I like them a lot, and they get good stuff for doing that. They get early access to T5S2 tournament pods. They also get early access to videos, and they get some Patreon exclusive videos that I'm going to be doing a little bit more consistently in the not too distant future. So you can join them over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, and you can also join the channel members who also get sweet emojis you can use during like premieres and stuff, which is like pretty cool. Little tortoise emojis, little Tyranid emojis. I got some Tyranid emojis in there too. So go ahead and join those guys. Big thanks for watching to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.